Good morning and welcome everyone. Today we are going to be looking at the Church's teaching on the preferential option for the poor, continuing our series on Catholic social teaching. This is the fourth of six that we're going to be looking at through the end of this month. Next time we'll be looking at solidarity, and we'll conclude with a study of our care for God's creation. This topic today flows naturally from our discussion of work last time we met, because in work we have the ability to contribute to the well-being of society and help lift one another out of poverty. So we will focus today on some documents of Catholic social teaching, including the document from the Second Vatican Council in the 1960s, Gaudium et Spes, which is the Church's constitution on the Church in the modern world. There's also, as I've referenced before in this series, the Compendium of the Church's Social Doctrine from 2005. And this time I'm also going to draw some quotations from Pope Benedict XVI, who wrote two items for us to consider today. Deus Caritas Est from 2005, which is God is Love, and from 2009, Caritas in Veritate, Charity in Truth. Both of those have some interesting insights for us as Catholics to consider how we should treat the poor. To get things started, I'd like to focus on Jesus' parables about God's concern for the poor. There's much in the Old Testament as well about caring for the poor and the vulnerable, but I'll focus my remarks today on New Testament teachings and then church documents to this issue. The first and likely most famous parable related to taking care of the needy is the parable of the Good Samaritan. This is interestingly one that Pope Francis has commented upon extensively in his most recent social encyclical, which we'll be looking at in more detail next week, called Fratelli Tutti. The parable of the Good Samaritan is as follows. A man fell victim to robbers as he went down from Jerusalem to Jericho. They stripped and beat him and went off, leaving him half dead. A priest happened to be going down that road, but when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. Likewise, a Levite came to the place, and when he saw him, he passed by on the opposite side. But a Samaritan traveler who came upon him was moved with compassion at the sight. He approached the victim, poured oil and wine over his wounds, and bandaged them. Then he lifted him up on his own animal, took him to an inn, and cared for him. The next day he took out 2 silver coins and gave them to the innkeeper with the instruction, "Take care of him. If you spend more than what I have given you, I shall repay you on my way back." And then Jesus indicates which of these 3 was neighbor to the robber's victim. And Jesus said, they respond, "The one who treated him with mercy." And Jesus said to him, "Go and do likewise." So this famous parable, there are many things to pick apart. First of all, the priests and the Levites in Jewish custom were those who were most responsible for the goings-on in the temple in Jerusalem, where Jews would travel to from throughout the region many times a year for various festivals, and they were supposed to be the ones who were most faithfully following God's law. But part of that law is to be generous towards strangers and the vulnerable and the poor. So ironically, it is the Samaritan who takes care of this man, and the Samaritan is among a group of people that the Jews had great animosity toward because they had differing religious traditions, which both stemmed from Moses and Abraham, but in different respects, and they had different spats with each other. So it's quite ironic that the Samaritan is the one to take care of this Jewish man left for dead. Pope Francis notes in his recent encyclical that sometimes we're intimidated by the robbers out there in our world, that we're afraid to stop and help someone because we could be taken advantage of ourselves, that we might not be able to take care of our own livelihood and those of our families. However, it is Jesus' teaching that we are to treat the poor and vulnerable with great mercy. Another parable is the parable of the rich fool. This rich man had land that produced a bountiful harvest. He asked himself, "What shall I do? For I do not have space to store my harvest." And he said, "This is what I shall do. I shall tear down my barns and build larger ones. There I shall store all my grain and other goods, and I shall say to myself, now as for you, you have so many good things stored up for many years. Rest, eat, drink, be merry. But God said to him, "You fool, this night your life will be demanded of you, and the things you have prepared, to whom will they belong? Thus will it be for the one who stores up treasure for himself, but is not rich in what matters to God." Another important parable here, first of all, because the guy has so much wealth, he has to invest some of his wealth into having larger storage bins to put all of his wealth. Rather than just saying, you know what, I don't need all this, I can give it away, and I continue working on the land here to produce wealth for myself and for others. Also, we note that God has a sense of justice towards those who take advantage of the poor by hoarding things needlessly to themselves. I mean, if you store a bunch of grain in a barn, how long is that going to keep? I don't know. It might spoil at some point, in which case, why not give that to the poor who actually need them? And finally, the parable concludes by noting that this man was rich, but not rich in the things important to God. And we'll talk a bit more about this later today, about how those who might be wealthy in a material sense could be very spiritually poor. Another parable of Jesus related to God's concern for the poor is the parable of Lazarus and the rich man. So there was a rich man who dressed in purple garments and fine linen and dined sumptuously each day. And lying at his door was a poor man named Lazarus, covered with sores, who would gladly have eaten his fill of the scraps that fell from the rich man's table. Dogs even used to come and lick his sores. When the poor man died, he was carried away by angels to the bosom of Abraham. The rich man also died and was buried. And from the netherworld, where he was in torment, he raised his eyes and saw Abraham far off, and Lazarus at his side. And he cried out, "Father Abraham, have pity on me. Send Lazarus to dip the tip of his finger in water and cool my tongue, for I am suffering torment in these flames." Abraham replied, "My child, remember that you received what was good during your lifetime, while Lazarus likewise received what was bad. But now he is comforted here, whereas you are tormented. Moreover, between us and you, a great chasm is established to prevent anyone from crossing who might wish to go from our side to yours or from your side to ours." He said, "Then I beg you, Father, send him to my father's house, for I have 5 brothers, so that he may warn them, lest they too come to this place of torment." But Abraham replied, "They have Moses and the prophets. Let them listen to them." He said, "Oh no, Father Abraham, but if someone from the dead goes to them, they will repent." Then Abraham said, "If they will not listen to Moses and the prophets, neither will they be persuaded if someone should rise from the dead." Lots of things here to note. First of all, death is common to both the rich and the poor, the wealthy and those who are taken advantage of. Death is a reality in our world which has an ending to life in order that God's justice might be brought to its fulfillment. And there's the sense that the justice required by God is that the poor be cared for, in accord with what Moses and the prophets have taught. We're not going to speak much about the Old Testament prophets, but famously the prophet Amos criticized the leaders of his day for not being kind towards the poor. So, the key thing here is that those who are closed off to the poor are also closed off from God and from the community of God represented by Abraham. It is in solidarity with the poor that humanity has a good relationship with God and can fulfill what is necessary according to the law, and as we see in Jesus Christ, according to the gospel. The past 3 parables we've looked through have come through the Gospel of Luke, which is famous for its attention paid towards Jesus' concern for the poor, for widows, orphans, all of those on the outskirts of society. But there's one more parable that's important to mention. That comes from the Gospel of Matthew. In this Gospel, in chapter 25, Jesus talks about how things will be at the end of time, when God executes his judgment over all. This is the parable of the sheep and the goats. "When the Son of Man comes in his glory, and all the angels with him, he will sit upon his glorious throne, and all the nations will be assembled before him. and he will separate them one from another, as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. He will place the sheep on his right and the goats on his left. Then the king will say to those on his right, 'Come, you who are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me drink. A stranger, and you welcomed me. Naked, and you clothed me. Ill, and you cared for me. In prison, and you visited me.' Then the righteous will answer him and say, 'Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you a drink? When did we see you a stranger and welcome you, or naked and clothe you? When did we see you ill or in prison and visit you?' And the king will say to them in reply, 'Amen, I say to you, whatever you did for the least brothers of mine, you did for me.' Then he will say to those on his left, 'Depart from me, you accursed, to the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. For I was hungry, and you gave me no food. I was thirsty, and you gave me no drink. A stranger, and you gave me no welcome. Naked, and you gave me no clothing. Ill and in prison, and you did not care for me.' Then they will answer and say, 'Lord, when did we see you hungry or thirsty, or a stranger, or naked, or ill, or in prison, and did not minister to your needs?' He will answer them, 'Amen, I say to you, whatever you did not do for one of these least ones, you did not do for me.' And these will go off to eternal punishment, but the righteous to eternal life." So, in this parable, we see a list of what we'll speak about later as the corporal works of mercy. And Jesus notes here that as our brother, we need to attend to his whole human family, because Christ is the head of the body, which is the church. And all the members of the church, whether formally associated with it or part of the people of God that are addressed by his message of salvation, all people are called to be part of God's family, and we should treat them as such. We should not ignore the least in our society, but attend to their needs. And in that way, we become like Christ, who himself gave all for those who were sinners. So, we have a little foundation for God's concern for the poor from the parables of Jesus. Let us now turn to some more developed concepts in Catholic social teaching. Over the years, the Church has reflected on the words of Jesus about how we are responsible as Christians for the needs of the poor and the vulnerable. The Church has developed two concepts in modern times to explain what is going on here. The first of these concepts, which I alluded to last time we met, is the universal destination of goods. According to this principle, the goods of the earth that God has given to us are to be shared among all people so that they can all meet their basic needs. This concept does not necessarily mean that all wealth should be shared equally with everyone, nor does it mean that the church should decide how God's property, the earth, should be divvied up. But it means that people have enough dignity, being in God's image and likeness, that they should have access to what they need for a decent livelihood. I'm going to quote a couple of passages from the church document Gaudium et Spes, which speaks to this concept. In paragraph 69, Gaudium et Spes writes, "God destined the earth and all it contains for all men and all peoples, so that all created things would be shared fairly by all mankind under the guidance of justice tempered by charity." So, justice and charity are both involved in this task of ensuring that all people have access to what they need. And the document also gives a specific list of things which pertain to people's basic needs. It says, "There must be made available to all men everything necessary for leading a life truly human, such as food, clothing, and shelter, the right to choose a state of life freely and to found a family, the right to education, to employment, and a good reputation, to respect, to appropriate information, to activity in accord with the upright norm of one's conscience, to protection of privacy and rightful freedom, even in matters religious. These touch on all the basic needs of the human person, those which are very biological and physical, like food and shelter and clothing, but also those that pertain to our dignity, respect, having a right to information and education, and freedom. All of these are important to our humanity and things that we in society should ensure are accessible to all. If they're not, there's some sort of injustice going on, or at least some lack of charity in our hearts that makes this evident. There's also a scarcity of things in our world, which makes it difficult for everything to be given to everyone who has needs. But it's important for us to look in our hearts as a church to see what we might have to give to those in need. So, finally, I'd like to quote from the Compendium from 2005, which draws from all sorts of Catholic teaching from centuries past. It writes, "The principle of the universal destination of goods requires that the poor, the marginalized, and in all cases those whose living conditions interfere with their proper growth, should be the focus of particular concern." So, when not all goods are made available to all, there has to be a remedy to that situation, which is indicated by the second major concept I'd like to introduce to you today, which is the preferential option for the poor and vulnerable. This could be basically defined as follows. This is when society's concern for the poor causes it to prioritize the satisfaction of their needs and the transformation of unjust social structures that cause poverty. If we look at the statistics about poverty, it's been something that's been going on for all of our history. There are certain measures taken by governments to minimize poverty. We can argue about whether they've been effective or not. In any case, these efforts to reduce poverty recognize that there's something wrong with our society that prevents the poor and the vulnerable and the marginalized from having access to what they really need. And so society needs to make its best effort to attend to the needs of the poor. If the poor in a society are not doing well, there's something wrong. And that's the first thing you look at. So, the church gives the following as a recommendation for attending to the needs of the poor as our first priority as a Christian church and as a secular society. Both of these are important halves of the effort at serving the poor, both that of the government and that of the church. The compendium indicates, giving alms to the poor is one of the chief witnesses to fraternal charity. It is also a work of justice, pleasing to God. Even if the practice of charity is not limited to almsgiving, but implies addressing the social and political dimensions of the problem of poverty. Love for the poor is certainly incompatible with immoderate love of riches for their selfish use. So in that quote, we see a couple of things. First, giving alms to the poor is one way in which, through charity, we can minister to people's needs. In some cases, our work of charity is making up for an injustice done to the person, whether that be an injustice that they've received from their family or from the government or from any other imaginable group. By our efforts of charity, we can give to those what they truly deserve. In some cases, you might imagine that we can give alms to the poor beyond what is required by justice, simply because of the goodness of Christ's example for us, that we should give without counting the costs. So I would like to quote from the letter of James in the New Testament, which is cited by the compendium here, relating to this conflict between the love of money and the love for the poor. Because the scriptures say that the root of all evil is not money, but the love of money. So here's James chapter 5, verses 1 through 6. Come now, you rich, Weep and wail over your impending miseries. Your wealth has rotted away. Your clothes have become moth-eaten. Your gold and silver have corroded, and that corrosion will be a testimony against you. It will devour your flesh like a fire. You have stored up treasure for the last days. Behold, the wages you withheld from the workers who harvested your fields are crying aloud, and the cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord of hosts. You have lived on earth in luxury and pleasure. You have fattened your hearts for the day of slaughter. You have murdered the righteous one. He offers you no resistance. So, we see a few things here. First of all, physical wealth is temporary. We're not going to take any of that with us when we die. And as wealth decays, we know that what we're putting our whole livelihood into, if we're concerned with wealth, is not ultimately fulfilling. It's not going to be long-lasting. We see some similarities here to what is taught by Jesus' parable of the rich man who built the barns, right? He tried to store everything up for himself. He ignored the needs of the people around him. We see an additional element here where this person gains wealth at the expense of his laborers. He did not pay them adequate wages. He withheld a just wage from them. And this injustice received by the workers causes them to cry out, and God hears their prayers, because God has an intimate relationship with the poor. He is deeply concerned with their well-being. He himself became poor so that in our poverty we might be made rich with the wealth of God's love. So it is more important to focus on the things of God than the things of this world, especially when that leads us to mistreat our brothers and sisters. One ironic thing here, which you might miss unless you look at it closely, is when he says, you have fattened your hearts for the day of slaughter. So, in these times, you have certain animals that you might use for milk, but others you want to use for meat, right? So you fatten them up. And they feel like, hey, I'm the king of the field here. Look at me. But lo and behold, you're the one who's going to get the axe. You're going to be put to death, and you are going to be eaten for lunch or dinner. So those who aggrandize themselves, who take all this wealth unto themselves, they feel like they're high and mighty. They're the ones who are most swiftly going to be met by God's justice. And their fate is not as good as those around them, contrary to what they might think. So, long story short, we need to exercise a preferential option for the poor and vulnerable, because that is the very heart of God, as revealed to us by Jesus Christ. All right. So, any thoughts or questions at this point about the two concepts we've outlined, the universal destination of goods and the preferential option for the poor? Any thoughts about what they mean or how we could live those out in our church, in our world? Yeah.
I'll help you out here.
Sure.
I'm not rich, so I don't have a dog in this fight, but what about people that save all their money and pass it on to their children and grandchildren, etc.? Are they in the same category of those who just hoard money? They're giving it away. They're not necessarily giving it to the poor, but they're making someone's life better.
Sure. So in one sense, you can say that it's not morally wrong to give inheritance to your children. Injustice takes place if wealth is gained or hoarded without giving back to society. So, a parent knows their children best. So they would know whether their children are of a sort to responsibly handle this wealth, to not just use it to live a grandiose lifestyle for themselves, but to put it to good use for their own families, for society more broadly. So in that sense, wealth in itself is not evil. It's more so the way in which it is used. Wealth is encouraged to be used in order to develop capital that can be used to make people's work more productive so that greater wealth can be produced for all. Wealth is encouraged to be donated through philanthropy to the poor to the extent that that's possible and the generosity of one's heart can permit that to take place. So if those who receive inheritance just plan to use it for their own good and not for others, that could be problematic, especially because of the scarcity of wealth in our world. Those who have little access to such wealth need to be reached out to. And as part of our church life, we need to include a sharing of our wealth with others. Not that our wealth was improperly gained through work. I mean, if we work for something and we earn an adequate wage or profit from it, that's fine. It's just the way in which that profit is then used to live one's life. That is of primary importance. So, yes, question.
I thought about that too, about what you should do in terms of reserving funding for yourself for later needs or your kids, is that you don't know what tomorrow's going to bring. And my feeling is that I don't know what my kids would do with whatever I am able to leave to them.
Mm-hmm.
But if I see a need now is the time that need has to be met.
Mm-hmm.
So I figure my kids, I'm not worried about my kids. They'll be okay. They both have decent jobs and they'll be able to provide for themselves. They're not going to wind up starving or not having a place to live.
Mm-hmm.
And there's nothing wrong with them working for a while either. But seeing poverty now, that's the thing that I feel needs to be met, and that's where I'd rather invest my money now.
Mm-hmm. Excellent point. And for many people, family is everything, as it should be. But family also has, as part of its mission, to go outside of itself, to attend to the needs of those beyond. So it's not simply, I have to make my family as wealthy as possible for generations to come. That's not the be-all and end-all of life. It is instead that the family is the heart of our little family community here, where we extend our mission in love to others, whether that be through giving our time, talent, or treasure. By developing love in the family, we can have a greater impact on society, and we can attend to people's needs right now who are not part of our biological family, but are part of our family of God, the church or the world under God's reign. So excellent point there. Yes?
Why not combine both? I mean, if you can save for your family and you can also give a percentage of whatever to charity, however, whichever groups, whatever. Isn't that the ideal?
Absolutely. To take care of your family. I mean, you can't just give all your wealth away and leave your children starving. That's ridiculous. So you do both. And that's, in good measure, you calculate personally what you think is a good percentage or whatever to allocate to the family or to the needs of society. Yes?
What would the position be, say, because I know from Scripture it talks about the woman that gave her last dollar to the treasury.
Yeah.
And all the wealthy people gave of their excess.
Right.
Well, what does the position say of the Catholic Church if I'm giving of my excess but not necessarily tapping into my comfort level? In other words, maybe one less night out to dinner this month and give that to a charity. So I guess what I'm saying is the church teaching more in line with the poor woman that gave of her what she had versus their wealth versus, in other words, if you're giving from your extra, are you giving? I guess.
Yeah, great question. So one thing that makes the woman who put the 2 coins in there and the rich who just put these large sums out of their excess, one major difference is the element of sacrifice. One has the impression that these wealthy persons putting their excess money in there, they're not sweating it. They've got plenty of wealth to have as much of a good time as they want. They aren't really sacrificing anything too much. But the woman sacrifices much. She gives the little she has. And what inspires sacrifice more than love? Love for those in need. So to sacrifice something in your life that you would otherwise do with your wealth can be a great sign of love. So if you go out to dinner one time less and donate the $30 or whatever you'd spend on your steak or whatever, if you donate that to the poor as a sacrifice and you don't go out, that could be a way in which giving of money is not just something you do without thinking about it, but it comes from the heart. Because the reason we have property and wealth in the first place is that we can lovingly share it with our community. And that's part of the beauty of having the right to private property, is that it can be something belonging to me, which I can give to you in love. And just to give you what I wouldn't even use anyways, because I got more money than I can use except to roll around in it. That's not a sacrifice. But to give out of what you have as a sacrifice for someone else, that is a truly loving and Christian act. So in that sense, yes, it's not so much how much you give, it's also the love with which you do it. So there are sort of two things that the preferential option for the poor concerns itself with. One, we give to people who have physical needs, but also we become spiritually rich by giving through sacrifice and through love to one another. And those who receive a gift of love, rather than just a random paycheck, feel loved. And that love bears fruit unto eternity, because God is love. That's what our whole life is supposed to be revolving around. Not money, but love. So some food for thought there as well. Yes?
I'd just like to expand it out for a minute.
Yes.
We talk about nuclear family, but then I want to expand it out like to parish family and say, okay, where do we take that? And I can remember a few years back, we used to say we are a tithing parish, and a portion of our offertory would go to a tithe that would be, I think a couple times they even put out a list of 2 or 3 charities that they were considering, and they wanted people to have input about where this money would go. And I think maybe it was on a monthly basis, as I recall, that it was donated somewhere. Now I realize that in COVID year that was probably just really hard. But I'm wondering if we still do that here, because it was always a great feeling of satisfaction for me that the parish as a whole made that offering.
Yeah.
From our wealth, from what we had, knowing that, while we have our scrapes and scrambles, that we actually are a pretty well-off parish, having come from a parish that wasn't so well-off, growing up in one that was that had very little to work with, but it had its people, So I always felt very good about that, and I'm wondering, do we still do that? And if we don't do that, why not? Why don't we do that?
Yeah.
And if we don't, could we make that happen again?
Yeah. As I'm sure you recall, during Advent, Father Kelly pitched the effort of having the parish members decide on specific things they wanted to have cared for when St. Vincent de Paul Society makes us aware of people with need.
He did quite well.
Yeah. So that is a great example of a one-off effort to do something like that.
Right.
And to sort of springboard off of that, to do something more consistent on a regular basis throughout the church year could be great. The idea was to have more money through that campaign so that it wouldn't be spent all immediately, but that it could carry over through the coming months of this year. That was sort of the idea behind it. But to give constantly, continually, with a sense of what we're doing with the money, that is important. It's important for the church to realize that their money is not just going to paying electricity bills, but it's going towards ministries of our church, outreach programs that are essential to the needs of our community. And I think that's very important. So I think that would be something to continue the conversation about, to think about what you're most passionate about in terms of giving, what particular needs you think in our community you care more for, whether it's providing social services to people or items for the food pantry or other ministries related to those with SNAP benefits or the homeless or any other community group you can think of, those who are discriminated against any sort of program. There are so many we could get involved with, and it's important, I think, that yes, we should, whether we funnel the money entirely through our church or also independently give it to different organizations, we can definitely, as a church, make that impact. And I think the parish is a group where we come together to call each other on to this mission that we all share from Christ. So I thank you for bringing that up, and that's something we should develop as well. Yes.
Was that a one-time collection towards, helping people out with their prescriptions
With the-
and that type of thing?
Sure.
Or was it a monthly or yearly actual tithe to a charity?
So the program we were speaking about during Advent was
Or
yeah.
is it
Right.
a normal going from the coffers of every time, whatever comes
Yeah. So
from everybody?
right. So I mean, the church always has an ongoing call to donate of what we can to help those in our community with needs. There hasn't always been an ongoing campaign specifically outlining where the money's going, but the parish certainly does have various ministries and so on that it can give its time, talent, and treasure to as a community. But if you have any specific thoughts about a few different items that we could allocate our resources towards, we can think about that with Father Kelly and maybe make an announcement about a campaign, or just do another call monthly to give where that's needed. Other than the bishop's appeal, which we always have every year. Other ministries of the church are very important that we keep them ongoing throughout the year. Tithing, as Abraham gave a tenth of what he had to Melchizedek, we likewise have a call to. In the gospel, we know that everything belongs to God that we have. So whether it's 10% of what we have, or 5%, or whatever in your heart you think is what you are able to give, the church community should be that place, and in which we find needs of the people that we can minister to. And so I thank you for those comments. Those are very important that we continue to develop in our church. Yes. All right. So let me continue on with this reflection here. We're going to talk about a few points which you may or may not have been wondering about. So the church talks about giving alms to the poor, which is a very important part of the church's ministry. But the church also speaks about social justice, the fact that people deserve certain things. Why does the church talk about matters that seem very political, figuring out which welfare programs are ideal for people, or determining what form of taxation is proper, or things like that? Well, the church doesn't deal with specifics like that, the governments do, but basically there are various principles that are important to consider, not just in terms of how we give, but also how we in society govern. Because we talked last time about distributive justice, the need of society to give what is due to its members. And so Pope Benedict XVI has some advice for us to consider how the church advises people who in turn use politics to serve the needs of the poor according to justice. In his writing Deus Caritas Est from 2005, Benedict says the following in paragraph 28. The church cannot and must not take upon herself the political battle to bring about the most just society possible. She cannot and must not replace the state. Yet at the same time, she cannot and must not remain on the sidelines in the fight for justice. She has to play her part through rational argument, and she has to reawaken the spiritual energy without which justice, which always demands sacrifice, cannot prevail and prosper. A just society must be the achievement of politics, not of the church, yet the promotion of justice through the efforts to bring about openness of mind and will to the demands of the common good is something which concerns the church deeply. So the church desires that we be like Christ in giving beyond what is necessary, but also to ensure that there are fewer poor people in our society, right? You can certainly serve the needs of the poor as you find them, or you can ask yourself, why are there so many poor people, and is there something we can do politically to reduce those in poverty, reduce the number of people in poverty? So the church encourages us to consider both works of charity, but also works of justice. Some focus so much on political solutions to poverty that they forget the spiritual element of charitable giving. And others do the opposite. They focus only on giving to the poor without thinking about why so many people are poor in the first place. Benedict recommends that we consider both in balance. He gives a couple of quotations from Deus Caritas Est related to this point. He writes in paragraph 26, "Since the 19th century, an objection has been raised to the Church's charitable activity, subsequently developed with particular insistence by Marxism. The poor, it is claimed, do not need charity, but justice. Works of charity, almsgiving, are in effect a way for the rich to shirk their obligation to work for justice, and a means of soothing their consciences, while preserving their own status and robbing the poor of their rights." Pausing there, basically, he's saying that some rich people might be like, hey, I'll give a little money to you there. That makes me feel good. But that doesn't really change anything because society is still broken in some ways. So Benedict is noting that if all you're doing is giving some money because it makes you feel good, like the people who gave all their large sums of wealth compared to the woman who gave her 2 coins. If all you're doing is just to make yourself look good or to feel happy or to ease your conscience, your guilt or whatever, that's only a very superficial way of addressing the problem. That a deeper look at the structures of our society, the way that work is available to people, the way in which benefits are distributed, these could be improved in such a way as to improve the state of the poor. Benedict continues, "Instead of contributing through individual works of charity to maintaining the status quo, we need to build a just social order in which all receive their share of the world's goods and no longer have to depend on charity." There's the famous phrase, give a man a fish, he eats for a day. Teach a man a fish, he eats for a lifetime, right? There must be a way for us to educate people so that they can work productively for themselves and for their families and find fulfillment in that. So it's not just about how many fish we give away, but how many skills we give people, how much support we give people as they transition from a state of hardship to a state of sustainability. Benedict notes that there is admittedly some truth to this argument that what we need is more political solutions than charity, but also much that is mistaken. He notes, "It is true that the pursuit of justice must be a fundamental norm of the state, and that the aim of a just social order is to guarantee to each person, according to the principle of subsidiarity," meaning that things are done on a local level, if at all possible, "his share of the community's goods. This has always been emphasized by Christian teaching on the state and by the Church's social doctrine." So, essentially, the government is not going to force you to give charity, but the government does have a role to ensure that all people give according to legal justice, that what is owed to society by us as individuals is required of us, because no person is meant to stay unto themselves, but to be part of a social network of the human family, which from the Christian perspective, we believe as being God's family in the church. So basically, Benedict is driving at the notion that we both need to do sacrificial works of charity, but also works of justice to better serve the needs of the poor. He continues in paragraph 28. "Love, caritas, will always prove necessary, even in the most just society." So there he's saying that even if we have a perfect political system in which things are given to everybody with needs, if that is just a transaction, an impersonal, impartial transaction with no heart in it, then the love of that society will suffer. So it's very important that in addition to having a political solution to the problem of poverty, we have each and every person bringing to the table what they have personally as a gift, as a sacrificial act of love. And in that way, love drives our preferential option for the poor, not so much just a sense of, okay, everybody needs to have the same amount of stuff, but it's also gift, because that's what God is. God gives of himself. So Benedict says, there is no ordering of the state so just that it can eliminate the need for a service of love. Whoever wants to eliminate love is preparing to eliminate man as such. There will always be suffering which cries out for consolation and help. There will always be loneliness. There will always be situations of material need where help in the form of concrete love of neighbor is indispensable. The state which would provide everything, absorbing everything into itself, would ultimately become a mere bureaucracy, incapable of guaranteeing the very thing which the suffering person, every person, needs. Namely, loving personal concern. So in summary, the Church has advised against a totalitarian communist government where everything is taxed and taken for the government's property, and then it distributes everything equally, because that makes everything an impersonal transaction. There's no love there. There's no respect for human freedom, responsibility. The interconnectedness of people is not forced upon us by the state, but it is a natural and organic result of God's grace in our hearts. We are a human family, and we do have a responsibility to give, to work for wealth that we can share. And that's not something that the government can force to happen. It is something which God inspires with his greater power than any government. So it's important to recognize God's role in our world in addition to that of the state. There's more I could say, but I'm going to skip ahead to the next topic. So, we've mentioned two terms before. Solidarity, which is being united as a family under God, and subsidiarity, which means that we shouldn't have everything distributed to people from on high. It's not like the federal government should do everything. There should be local governments taking care of people and local organizations, churches. So there's room for private efforts of charity and local government to do its work. The closer you are to the situation of someone in need, the more you can lovingly get a sense for what they truly need and how you can truly help them. Rather than just throwing money at the problem, you work with them. There are case managers who deal with people in poverty to help get them into a better place. There are people who lovingly give their time to those who feel alone. So it's important that, on the one hand, we be inspired by our connectedness as a human family to give to those in need, but also to not just let the government take care of everything, not to just believe that if we raise the taxes on the wealthy that everything will be fine. We also need to, in our own sphere of influence, be responsible to our Christian mission to care for those in need. And that might be people who are physically poor, but also those who are spiritually in need of love. So, one final thing I can mention here is that there's something especially unique about what the church is doing when it gives, as opposed to outside of a Christian context. And that is the fact that caritas, the very love of God, inspires not just elimination of poverty or reduction of poverty, but the healing of our souls, which are broken and wounded by sin. There is a formation of the heart that needs to take place in how we give of ourselves. So, love of neighbor, which you all know we should love our neighbor as ourselves. That's from Leviticus 19 in the Old Testament. That is something that should be a consequence of our faith. Our faith in God calls us to love our neighbor as ourselves. Because what matters most is not simply the works we do, but the works we do in a spirit of faith and love. It's not good works alone that will save us, but works done with the spirit of God's love. All right, one final note. This is very important. We mentioned earlier Matthew 25, the different things that we're supposed to do for others because you're doing them for Jesus that way. The Compendium of the Social Doctrine of the Church says the following in paragraph 184. And this relates to the distinctness of the Church's charitable activity. The Church's love for the poor is inspired by the gospel of the Beatitudes, by the poverty of Jesus, and by his attention to the poor. This love concerns material poverty and also the numerous forms of cultural and religious poverty. The Church teaches that one should assist one's fellow man in his various needs and fills the human community with countless works of corporal and spiritual works of mercy. So I'd like to conclude today focusing on how corporal works of mercy, attending to people's physical needs, is complemented by the equally important spiritual works of mercy, both of which fall under our mission of attending to the needs of the poor. Corporal works of mercy include the traditional list of feeding the hungry, giving drink to the thirsty, clothing the naked, sheltering the homeless, tending to the sick, visiting prisoners, and burying the dead. But the Church also, in its history, has presented spiritual works of mercy. And these include, in its traditional formulation, admonishing the sinner, in other words, intervening with someone if you really need to, if they are in a position where they're being self-destructive, and you can help them out of their problem of addiction or loneliness or depression. You can intervene and help them to turn away from sin and to be faithful to the gospel. You can instruct the ignorant, which means that those who don't know, who aren't educated about what is best for them, you can be that guiding light for them. Also, we are called to counsel the doubtful, those who have a lack of faith in this world filled with evil and chaos. We can give comfort to them and help them to be feeling like they're members of a human family. They're not just on their own. And there's something they can believe in, something they can hope in. We are also called to comfort the sorrowful, dwell with people in their sadness, to have compassion. We are also called to bear wrongs patiently, to forgive. And finally, to pray for the living and the dead. In this way, by spiritually giving ourselves as a church, we have a reason for giving things. Giving things and money is great. But the reason why we do that is that we can bring ourselves as a human family to God. This world of poverty will not last forever, but the kingdom of God will last forever. And it is in that kingdom that the spiritual richness that Christ offers to us is brought to fulfillment. And here on earth now, we are called to share that with one another. So, follow the examples of the many saints in the church who give of themselves to the poor. People like Mother Teresa, who ministered to the poor and sick in Calcutta. To Vincent de Paul, who gave to set up foundations to serve the poor. To St. Nicholas, whom we celebrate every Christmas, giving money to those in need to avoid a horrible lifestyle. Catherine Drexel inherited millions from her parents, spent a lot of it to help Native Americans and African Americans, and she built schools and hospitals. There are so many great examples in the church that we can follow of people who are like Christ. And we too, giving of ourselves physically and spiritually, can have a preferential option for the poor in all we do as a church and as a society. Thank you.